So are you in Albuquerque today?
I am. I am in Albuquerque. I'm going to Texas tomorrow though, so
Okay.
yeah.
Where in Texas are you headed to?
I'm going to Brownsville for literally 24 hours to see an exhibit that I want to write about. So I'm taking a very quick trip.
Oh, that's cool. What is
Yeah.
it an exhibit of?
There's a museum called the Costume Museum of the Americas, of all
Oh,
places in Brownsville. And I have been wanting to do a piece on this 1960s designer from Mexico named Josefa, who did all these really popular it was like she was called the Coco Chanel of Mexico.
oh wow.
And she
Cool.
designed all these dresses that were using um, kind of hand embroidery, like craft techniques, but then they were sold at like Neiman Marcus and like Hollywood starlets would wear that. So she's got this really interesting connection to high fashion. And they have an exhibit of her gowns that
Wow.
I want to go
Oh my
take
gosh.
photographs of so I can write about them.
That is so cool.
Yeah.
Wait,
I know
yeah.
it's kind of niche, but yeah.
No. Oh my gosh. Wow. The Coco Chanel of Mexico. That's neat.
Yeah.
I'll have to Google that.
Yeah, she's become, when I started looking into her a few years ago, you could find her you could get, use pieces on the eBay and thrift shops and things like that, and the price just keeps going. They become collector's items.
Oh, I bet. Oh,
Yeah,
neat.
it's
Look into that.
interesting.
Our board chair loves costume design stuff, so we'll have to look.
Oh, that's neat. Yeah, I've got I'm hoping my next project is gonna look at fashion. So I'm moving from mezcal to fashion. I'm quite kind of a leap, but
We will follow you. We'll have to keep an eye on
yeah.
that. That could be a pretty
I
fun
don't know how that
webinar.
relates to archaeology in the Southwest, but
We're very eclectic around here,
yeah,
yeah.
that's my understanding.
And fashion is, yeah, that's a thing through all time and space. So.
Yes, true.
All right. Well, on that note, we're just 4 o'clock. So thank you everyone for joining us. Before we go ahead and get started, I'm going to do a few of our usual introductory slides. If you're joining us for the first time, we are Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, nonprofit research and education center here in beautiful Southwest Colorado. Beautiful rainy Southwest Colorado this week. As we're doing our Zoom webinar, if you have questions at any time during the talk, you can put them in the Q&A and then they won't get lost in the chat if there is chatting happening. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel for past webinars and for this webinar. We are still working on getting back up on Facebook Live, so we're not up right now, but we will keep you posted on that for the future. I'd like to begin with some acknowledgements. We acknowledge the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Diné, and Jicarilla Apache people on whose traditional homelands our campus sits. With the work we're doing at Crow Canyon, we seek to bring light into the darkness of memory that these lands, waters, wildlife, and her descendants hold because of policies of removal, genocide, and displacement. We seek paths that support and align with Indigenous people and communities. With gratitude, we honor the contributions of present-day Indigenous communities, descendants, and colleagues with whom we partner, who guide our work and our mission. So just going to highlight a few programs because if you're looking for something to do this summer and fall, there are still some spaces available. Go ahead and grab the QR code or check our website. But this is actually part 2 of a Glen Canyon program. Pretty amazing. I was out last year with our Indigenous scholars on this program. As people probably know, if you're from this area, the lake levels of Lake Powell are dropping significantly, creating all kinds of issues and concerns for cultural resources, for environmental resources. It's pretty amazing to be out on the lake and in Glen Canyon, learning about the past, present, and future. So consider this program if you are looking for something to do this fall. And then also going a little farther south into southern Arizona, with some amazing Indigenous scholars and some of our partners from Archaeology Southwest, our friends down there in southern Arizona. So this is moving out farther into November. And then even more recently, we've got a really cool local workshop, 3 days of Indigenous foodways, an immersive experience here in Southwest Colorado. Again, this is kind of the second time we're doing this one. We did one last year. Really, really incredible. So please check out the QR codes or email or call us if you have any questions, and consider coming out and being out on the landscape with us. The next couple of weeks are webinars. We have some, in addition to our incredible scholar this week, some amazing folks coming up, some really interesting new research, rethinking the origins of horse domestication and its impact on the ancient world, with Dr. William Taylor next week. The week after that, this is really an update on research at Crow Canyon, because this is Dr. Katie Williams, our postdoc. Our new postdoc this year, talking about LIDAR in the central Mesa Verde region. So please check us out the next couple of weeks as well. As always, we want to point out and issue our gratitude to all of you. This is an entirely free webinar series, entirely supported by your donations. Thank you, everyone. And a huge shout out to the founder of our webinar series, Taylor Hasbrook, here in Chaco Canyon. Who we have lost recently, and we still think about her every day. And we are just so grateful for what she created for all of us here at Crow Canyon. So thank you to Taylor. Thank you to everyone who continues to support our program. Without further ado, I'm extremely honored to introduce our distinguished speaker today, Dr. Ronda Brulotte, who is the professor and a professor and chair of the Department of Geography and Environmental Sciences at the University of New Mexico. Dr. Brulotte is an interdisciplinary scholar with training in sociocultural anthropology and Latin American studies, whose research focuses on craft economies, critical heritage, and materiality culture in Mexico. Her books include Between Art and Artifact, Archaeological Replicas and Cultural Production in Oaxaca, Mexico, Edible Identities, Food as Cultural Heritage, and Mezcal in Oaxaca, a craft spirit for the global marketplace. Welcome, Dr. Brulotte, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, thank you. I really appreciate this invitation to be with you all today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully I did it correctly so that we can get going here. Okay. Looks like everybody can see that, I think. Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah, it looks good. All right.
Yeah.
So thank you for the introduction. I should say that even though I'm currently in a geography department, my trainings is as a cultural anthropologist. And I have worked very closely with a lot of archaeologists throughout my career. And so this talk that you see today is really informed by a long-term ethnographic project that I carried out in Oaxaca, Mexico. Um, and I want to also frame what I'm going to say today by noting that I've worked in Oaxaca for close to 30 years as an anthropologist. And part of the impetus for this project came from watching the changes that occurred in the mezcal industry from when I first started until the present day. Watching mezcal go from something that was virtually unknown outside of Oaxaca to something that is now really truly a globalized product. So my recently published book aims to kind of explore the creation of a market for mezcal, and particularly mezcal as what we now think of as a craft or artisanal product or artisanal spirit. I like this image. I like to start with this because it was posted by the owners of a small mezcal distillery in Oaxaca, El Rey Zapoteco. And they were very excited to show their or their mezcal being launched in Paris, right? So mezcal's traveled a very long ways all over the world, and now you can find it, in places all over the world. I was just in India recently. I saw mezcal being sold there. It's in China. It's throughout Europe, Australia. I think it's probably on all the continents now. Let me see, make sure I can. So I don't know. Unfortunately, I'm not live with you. So normally I would ask if I had an audience, how many people visited Oaxaca, how many people have tried mezcal, and usually Oaxaca is one of those places that people have visited. It's well known, and it's become increasingly well known as a place where you go to really enjoy Mexican cuisine and increasingly mezcal. But one thing that I like to note, before mezcal became popular, Oaxaca was really attractive to tourists, beginning kind of in the 80s and the 90s as a center of craft production, a place where people produced a wide variety of handicrafts, from very traditional things like woven baskets to more modern day innovative crafts like the wood carvings that you see in the slide up here. It's also very well known for its archaeological sites. Some of the oldest sites in Mesoamerica, Monte Alban, Mitla, are very well known sites within the region and receive, thousands of visitors each year. For those of you that aren't familiar with Oaxaca, I did include a map up here so you can kind of see where Oaxaca sits within the country of Mexico. You'll notice that it's in the kind of far south, um, just above Chiapas, before you get to Guatemala. Oaxaca is, in addition to being a center of handicraft production, it's also one of the most indigenous states in Mexico and one of the poorest states in Mexico. Depending on who you talk to, there's anywhere from 13 to 16 roughly indigenous languages that are spoken throughout the state. And some of that is represented on the map that you see in front of you. So mezcal is something that has been produced in Oaxaca for a very long time. It is, and one thing a point that I always like to make is that mezcal is a drink that happens after Spanish arrival in the New World. Right? There's some archaeological discussions happening right now about whether there was distillation technology in pre-Hispanic Mexico. And some Mexican archaeologists have been arguing very strongly for that, but the material evidence to this point doesn't strongly favor that argument, and most scholars still conclude that only fermented alcohol was present in pre-Hispanic Mesoamerica, and not distilled alcohol. So the Europeans brought distillation technology. It's if we think about the term of Columbian exchange, right? All the foods and technologies that were shared between the new and the old worlds. Distillation technology was something that made its way to the new, quote unquote new world. And obviously the the natural landscape and the plants there included agave, right? And so they adapted agave to distilling it and making a new drink out of it. So in Mexico, historically, mezcal is something that was made throughout Mexico. But in Oaxaca, the region I'm talking about, today accounts for about 90% of the mezcal production in Mexico. And it has a long and important cultural history in the region. I'm not going to talk too much about, its traditional uses, but I do want to sort of highlight that it is something that is very important to various rituals in communities, particularly in indigenous communities. It's used for celebrations like the Day of the Dead. There's a picture there where you see the young man holding a basket of fruit. That is a baptism. And the godparents usually will do a formal toast, sometimes using mezcal, sort of cementing this new bond that is formed through baptism and birth of a new baby. Um, I also want to note that up until very recently, Mezcal was something that was made at a very, very local level, usually in households. You can see a couple there just putting through a funnel a mezcal that they've made. And people would not typically sell this. I mean, they might commercialize it in a very local sense, right? Maybe sell it to neighbors or in a local market. But people were not making mezcal to sell it to bars in New York City or to ship it to Europe, right? It was very much a product that was made to be consumed and distributed in a local setting. As a result, most of the production facilities were what we might think of as, backyard operations. This is the lower left-hand picture is one that I took up in the Mixteca region, showing a producer's facility that, is very rustic, very simple. And, not surprisingly, these are not people producing at a large scale. Like when we think about tequila, big, manufacturing plants, mezcal for the most part has remained a very small scale artisanal product. Okay. Fast forward to 2010. Um, this is the year that most people, there's not one particular moment when we can say suddenly mezcal, boomed, but most people, if you had to say, when did mezcal become globalized? Most people would point to around 2010, 2011. And coincidentally, I started this project in 2011. I started doing the field work for this. So one of the advantages I had as an anthropologist was being able to see the development of a market from its inception to the present day. So my field work was able to really kind of track, yearly as mezcal became more and more well known. When I started doing this research, hardly anybody I knew. If I said, do you know what mezcal is? Maybe somebody might have said, oh, that's a smoky tequila, or, but most people had never even heard the term, right, in the United States. Now, when I give a talk about the topic, most people in the audience have heard of it, right? So, in a very short period of time, mezcal went from being a drink that was very local. It was associated with rural peoples, working class peoples, campesinos in Mesoamerica, to something now that is being consumed in very upscale spaces like the bar that you see there on the screen, which is in Las Vegas, Nevada. It's a whole mezcal themed bar, and they actually are, as you can tell from some of the decoration, are borrowing from some of the other craft traditions from the Oaxaca region, as did the movie Coco, if any of you saw that. So my research more broadly is looking at what happens when a drink that was once associated with rural and indigenous communities becomes a global commodity, right? Something that, goes from being very local to being very global, and all of the attendant issues that arise with that transformation. First, I find it's helpful to just do a little bit of clarification around the actual terminology of mezcal. And it gets a little bit confusing because on one hand, mezcal can be a general term that refers to any alcoholic spirit that is distilled from agave. And so by that definition, tequila is a type of mezcal, so we can think of as a sort of a general umbrella term. Um, but not all mezcal is tequila, and this gets into what I'll talk about here in a second, which is a system called denomination of origin, which creates specific registered statuses for products within Mexico. I've included this picture here just as an example. Tequila is sort of the foil to mezcal, or is the antithesis of what consumers think mezcal is, in that tequila is often made at larger scales. It's much more, historically has been much more industrialized than mezcal has. The facilities are larger, they use more modern machinery. They use steam ovens instead of pit roasting, and those are some of the distinctions I'll talk about in a little bit. But generally speaking, tequila is a much bigger market. It has a longer history and it's much more commercial. So people now are gravitating towards mezcal because they see it as something that is more authentic, more craft in nature, more of an artisanal product, and that is part of its selling point. Um, so the second definition of mezcal, and this is the way that I use it in my book, is as a specific class of agave spirits that is protected by a denomination of origin. And in the mezcal denomination of origin, or DO, I'll just use the abbreviation. Unlike tequila, mezcal must be 100% agave. Tequila does not have to be 100% agave. And one of the interesting things about mezcal versus tequila is that mezcal can be made from any number of agave varieties, whereas tequila can only be made from one variety of agave, and that's what you probably have seen on a bottle as blue agave. And so it's much more limited in the variety of plants that can be used. So mezcal is kind of has this infinite quality to it, right? Because there's so many variables that go into its production. The range of agaves that can be used produces a wider range of actual products that can result. Okay. I want to say a few things about the denomination of origin, because I think this is really an important feature of how mezcal entered into a commercial market and how it's been shaped. And so a denomination of origin is a type of geographical indicator. And this is something that quote unquote guarantees that a product originates from a specific place, right? And it also denotes qualities or characteristics that come from the geographical environment. And that's both the natural features of the environment as well as the human factors, right? So we think about terroir, the concept of terroir that's often applied to wine, right? We think of the minerality of the soil, or the amount of rainfall, or those sort of physical features, right? The physical geography, but also the cultural aspects of winemaking, right? That have evolved over hundreds, if not thousands of years. And the geographical indicator is unique to a specific location. Excuse me. And these denomination of origins come out of something, and they take various forms. In France, they have something called an AOC, which I'm gonna butcher the pronunciation. It's Appellation d'origine contrôlée, or something along those lines if you speak French. I always have a Spanish twist in my French. But they are protected designations, and they come out of something called the Lisbon Agreement, which happened in 1958. And it created a common definition of the concept of denominations of origin, and a union that was formed to protect and register, or trademark denominations of origins through something called the World Intellectual Property Organization. And so there's any number of products now that have something like a denomination of origin. I included this picture of San Marzano tomatoes, right? So if you go to Whole Foods, right, you can choose between, the regular tomatoes and these fancy ones that usually cost more money to buy because they are a special product with a protected status. I've already mentioned a few other things, but Champagne in France, Parmesan cheese or Parma ham in Italy, those are protected products. And Mezcal in Mexico also is a protected product under this DO system. In Mexico, there are a number of products that have denominations of origin. And it's not just, people tend to think of agricultural products or food products. We have a little list here of, vanilla, mangoes, a specific variety of mangoes, coffee from Chiapas. You see up here mezcal and tequila, but also handicrafts. There's certain handicrafts that are protected. Talavera tile, our pottery, a certain type of lacquerware, amber amber that they make into jewelry that is from Chiapas as well. So these are also products that are included within Mexico's system of denomination of origin. Um, at the bottom of the screen here, you'll see two important dates, and I think this is a really important thing to consider. Also, we wonder why did mezcal boom when it did? When tequila had been in the market much longer. Tequila was the first denomination of origin in the Western Hemisphere, and it got its DO in 1974. So tequila entered into this sort of legible commercial market much earlier than mezcal, because mezcal doesn't get a DO until 1995. And 1995, not coincidentally, is when some of the first quote unquote artisanal mezcal starts appearing in the US market. And that's a longer story, but a man by the name of Ron Cooper, who's an artist based in Taos, New Mexico, started marketing mezcal from Oaxaca under his label Del Maguey. Okay. I just want to quickly show this map because it is, I think, a good representation of the distribution of mezcal. Like I said, about 90% of the commercial mezcal that we buy is produced in Oaxaca. But Oaxaca's not the only state where you can make mezcal. And you'll notice here all the lime green sections on the map are states which, under the denomination of origin, can legally produce and commercialize mezcal. So Oaxaca's number 14 on the map, but you can see that, and Mexico's a very large, geographically large, it's ecologically diverse, it's culturally diverse, and you've got people all over the state in non-contiguous regions making mezcal and calling it mezcal. So this idea that mezcal is a local thing to Oaxaca, even though that's the perception, a lot of the marketing, in reality, mezcal is made in a variety of climatic zones by lots of different people, both indigenous and non-indigenous, and that's something that kind of gets lost in the market in the US anyways. So why do I bring up the denomination of origin? Why is this important? And particularly, who's deciding, what fits under this denomination of origin? Who gets to decide what's mezcal and what is not mezcal? The denomination of origin, if you think about it, and in its larger intent, is to protect products from competition or counterfeit products entering a market. There's all kinds of ostensibly good reasons for having a denomination of origin. But at the same time, we also have to think about what are the maybe the unanticipated consequences of bureaucratizing and commercializing a product and giving it a protected status. And so one of the things with mezcal is once it gets its DO in 1995, right, it is now something that is regulated. It's regulated at the federal level, it's regulated at the local level. It creates a whole set of certification processes that some people are able to enter into and achieve and get their product certified and marketed. But it also leaves a lot of people out of that certification process and leaves them unable to participate in the market for mezcal that is opened up and exploded. Okay. One of the things that I've been trying to think through what has happened to mezcal in terms of being a local product and then becoming a global product is how does the product itself get reimagined and how does the consumer base for the product change, right? If nobody in the United States 10 or 15 years ago knew what mezcal was, then how does it become something that's on everybody's radar? And one of the theoretical models that I found really helpful for thinking about this is something called the enrichment economy. And this is a term that was coined by two sociologists, Boltanski and Isquere, in 2020. They talk about in post-industrial, post-producer societies, right? A new way of creating value for products. If you think a place like the United States, right, we've moved from being an industrially active, we don't produce a lot of things in the United States. We've moved to a service-based economy largely. Um, and so if we're not producing things, how do we create value around the things that we do have, right? And one of the arguments that these two scholars make is that um, in these sort of post-industrial scenarios, people turn to the past and recast the past in new terms that allows usually the richest members of society to reap some sort of economic profit from that. And so the things and places that are already in existence, right, they get re-narrativized. They get new stories told about them. They get reinvented so that they have a new kind of value and attract a whole new consumer base. And Boltanski and Esquerra in their critique talk about specific kinds of markets that we see in enrichment economies, and they identify some things that are not coincidentally very good descriptors of mezcal, the market for mezcal. They identify fine arts, luxury goods, and collectibles. They talk about the creation, exploitation of natural patrimonies, heritage sites, and Appalachian controle regimes, right? If you think about mezcal now, right, it fits many of these criterias. It's now a luxury good. It went from being what was considered to be a stigmatized alcohol, really, something associated with the poor, with indigenous people, something that rich people in Mexico did not drink, and certainly Americans were not drinking, to being, a luxury good, something that could command a very high price. It is now considered a heritage drink, right? It is something of cultural heritage associated with people in a particular place. It is also got, as we just went through, a denomination of origin, which is a form of a controlled appellation of origin, right? So it's this naming system of classifying and protecting, right? Generates its own value. And Boltanski and Esquerra argue that this sort of value creation relies on storytelling. So it's creating a new story about an old thing or an old product, right? That increases the value of that commodity. I mean, to use maybe an archaeological analogy, right? A place that's just abandoned and left there, um, which has one kind of value, or maybe it doesn't have value, to turning something into a heritage site in which you charge admission, a whole tourism economy springs up around it. Those two things have different values, right? Um, it's not to say that the abandoned site didn't have meaning for people that might be associated with it, but taking the heritage site and telling a new story and telling people that it has a certain kind of value, right, changes the place of that site within an economy. And that same thing has happened to mezcal. So part of my work in the book was to talk about what is the narrative that's being told about mezcal now, and why is it making it such a valuable thing? So one of the things that in the most, I guess I would say, the idealized version, right? Because mezcal is a lot of things, and there's no one, how would I say this? It's made by lots of different kinds of people in different kinds of places, but the idealized version that we think about as being highly marketable is mezcal as something that is traditional, particularly from Oaxaca. So even though it's made in all those places, it's very place-based to Oaxaca, because Oaxaca itself has become a very commoditized place, right? It's a place that is heavily touristed now. It's become a global foodie destination, and mezcal has been part of that growth. Mezcal, another part of the story is highlighting the indigeneity of the product. Even though some of the people that make mezcal are not necessarily self-identified as indigenous, some communities are, but that it gets very much highlighted in the narrative. It's part of what gives it value. Which is, if you think about it, it's ironic because for so long, many indigenous food and drink products were stigmatized, ignored. They were not consumed by people outside of those communities, and now they're being appropriated and resold. We think of, quinoa, right, from the Andes. When I was growing up, nobody had heard of quinoa. And now it's become sort of this superfood, right? That you can go to Whole Foods and pay top dollar for organic quinoa. It was traditionally a food consumed by indigenous peoples in the Andean region, and now there's a market for it, and there's a whole transformation of the agricultural economy there. But going back to mezcal, it's indigenous. Part of the important story that's being told is thinking of mezcal as a craft or artisanal product, right? So highlighting its rustic production technique. And that's why it's so important that mezcal not be seen as an industrial product like tequila. It always has to distinguish, people always have to distinguish it from tequila to maintain the value of the craft product. And one of the things that I find interesting is when I started working in Oaxaca in the mid 90s, a place so well known for its crafts. If you had asked somebody, to identify the craft products of the region, nobody would have thought to include mezcal in that, right? Mezcal wasn't thought of as a craft thing. It wasn't part of the broader category of handicrafts, right? And so it's only recently that this idea of it as an artisanal product has really come into being. The narrative of mezcal also stresses its spirituality and connection to community. And of course, I mentioned this already, but the idea that it's small scale, right? That things are made in a very slow, small scale way is part of the story that makes mezcal's value increase. And you can see this to kind of illustrate how the value around the artisanal product has become increasingly important. There was a big controversy in the mezcal world, and I think this really highlights why these distinctions become so important in the way we talk about mezcal. Back in 2017, within the denomination of origin, there was a proposal to modify the criteria for the designation of mezcal and the labeling on the bottles themselves, what you could call it. And they decided rather than calling everything just simply mezcal within the denomination of origin, that they were going to break it down into 3 subcategories. One of them was just called, or was going to be called initially industrial mezcal. And you can see here, and I said earlier that some mezcal is made in more industrial facilities like you're more likely to find in tequila. But you can imagine why, if you made mezcal this way, why you wouldn't want to label it as industrial mezcal. It loses a lot of the mystique, right? If people think of a product made in some sort of industrial way, it decreases its value. And so they finally settled on simply the label of mezcal rather than industrial mezcal. The second subcategory was something called artisanal mezcal. And this is mezcal that was produced in quote unquote traditional ways. There's all of these different categories have criteria attached to them, but you can see the difference here in that the grinding of agave is using kind of a traditional, sometimes referred to as an Egyptian mill. In Mexico, it's called a tahona, which is this giant stone wheel that's used to crush the agave. But this idea that you are adhering to artisanal methods rather than these industrial methods, right? So there was this real push to distinguish these different types of production. And then there was a third category, which was called ancestral mezcal, which it's really interesting because it's distinct from the artisanal mezcal in that it's uh, mezcal that's made in it's distilled in copper pots, right? And that the processing of the mezcal is done completely by hand. Um, I still think the terms are really problematic. I mean, ancestral, artisanal. Um, they're both ancestral in some ways. So, these terms are a bit arbitrary, but people were really, really defensive about these new labels that were being imposed on their product, right? Because clearly the intent was to distinguish products that maybe required more human input, right? And not surprisingly, something that's made exclusively by hand, right, is the idea is that you're going to bump up its value. You're going to create more demand, a higher value for the product because it's ostensibly handmade, right? And so people that were producing, again, mezcal in more industrial ways, they don't want their product to be set off from these, quote unquote, artisanal production techniques, right? Because they lose value for their product. So I'm getting close to time here, but what has happened in Oaxaca as a result of the mezcal boom, as a result of this transformation of a drink that started out, like I said, very localized, to some degree stigmatized. um, Once you start regulating and naming and marketing, right, as with many things, you run the risk of appropriation, right? Or in this case, I think gentrification is the best word to use. Mezcal has become really popular in marketing campaigns. I always pick on Vogue magazine because Vogue magazine, for whatever reason, loves to highlight mezcal. They, are constantly running articles about it. They do photo shoots. I mean, this is a ridiculous photo shoot of a very slender, probably not Oaxacan woman posing in front of a mezcal outlet, a very local place where you would go and buy mezcal in Oaxaca. And, it's a sort of stark contrast, right? I think this really highlights what's happened in a very short period of time. You've taken something, mezcal that once was made available to local people for use in a variety of ways and turned it into something very upscale, right? That is now worthy of putting in a Vogue magazine, photo shoot. They did not, just as a side note, a few years ago, they did Mercedes-Benz Fashion Week, did their whole Fashion Week show. They staged it in the middle of agave fields in Oaxaca. So you had this very, very stark contrast between, historically poor, marginal, indigenous communities and this sort of global elite market for luxury products kind of colliding. And that's what you see happening in Oaxaca. Um, I'm just going to end here because I know my time's drawing to a close. I want to be able to answer some of your questions. One of the major arguments that I make in my book is that the story of mezcal, this appropriation and transformation into this sort of global product, is the story of Oaxaca itself, the place itself. If you've been to Oaxaca in the last 10 years and the time that mezcal has exploded, you'll also see that the city itself has been transformed. Just as mezcal has become a well-known, well-consumed product, so has Oaxaca. And there's been a lot of backlash against this. If you go to Oaxaca, there's a movement against the gentrification of the city, and all of the sorts of businesses and the high cost of living that has that the city's seen. It's now one of the most expensive cities in Mexico, even it is still in one of the poorest, most indigenous regions. And I like this to show this cartoon as just sort of a stopping point. It was something that appeared in 2015 in the local newspaper, and it's by a local political cartoonist who does a lot of sort of, sarcastic takes on local politics. But this one I really caught my eye because it's directly referring to this transformation that I'm talking about. And it says, if you don't read Spanish, before, if you drink mezcal, they pegged you as a drunk and poor, and now it's the latest fashion, right? So they're pointing out this irony in something that 20 years ago would have marked you as a poor person. Now it's this high fashion thing. And it continues to say, and now everybody's an expert in mezcal. And now they sell it back to us, right? They sell it back to the locals at a really high price, just because they're empresarios, entrepreneurs, brands, and these people often already been from Oaxaca. So this is a commentary on people from the outside, um, entrepreneurs coming down both from Mexico City, other places, from the United States, from Europe, buying up mezcal and rebranding it, right? Bringing it into this enrichment economy, giving it a new story and profiting from that without local people benefiting and raising the price of the drink for local people in the process. So with that, I will end, and I just want to thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to take some questions now. I'll stop my share here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brulotte. Wow, just fascinating, and love that you ended on the political commentary because throughout your presentation it certainly resonated, when you talked about the enrichment economies and this turning to the past as a response to the alienation and emptiness of advanced capitalism, and then appropriating what is left, right, after centuries
That's
of colonialism. I mean, it's just like our our mutual friend and colleague Teresa Pasquale would she doesn't ever head down on her desk as often as I do, and she's used to this.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh
I
my
mean,
gosh. Yeah.
it's it's happening all over the world. I
Yeah.
think this is a really stark example of it, but I think indigenous peoples everywhere, right, have to contend with this, the appropriation of cultural heritage and then the rebranding and, asking who's profiting from it.
Yeah.
And this is,
Yeah.
like I said, one very, very vivid example of that.
Okay. Oh, thank you for excellent research. Well, we have a bunch of questions, but I think we have plenty of time. So let me
Okay,
jump
yeah,
into some.
we got about 15 minutes. We can do some damage
Yeah,
here.
totally. Fun questions too. All right, well, I'm going to start with the super fun one, which is like a cross-cultural comparison. One of our regular viewers, an archaeologist, colleague, and friend of ours, says that the DO reminds me a lot of single malt Scotch from Scotland, and he is a Scottish single malt guy. To call a product single malt, it must be created in Scotland, just like champagne in France. In the geographic areas the various single malts are distilled, and in Scotland must be on the label, done proudly by the distillers. And just wondered what you thought about that from a comparative standpoint.
Oh, I think, it's interesting when you talk to, I mentioned Ron Cooper, who brought the first quote unquote artisanal brand to the United States, Del Maguey. And, he's kind of considered the father of artisanal mezcal in the United States. And he actually trademarked for his brand, Single Village Mezcal, right? And he told me he modeled it on whiskey, right? It's this idea of being tied to a very specific place. And when you talk to people in Oaxaca about mezcal, these aficionados, they often compare it to whiskey. They're like, it's not like wine, it's much more like whiskey. The whole framework that's been generated around it is very similar. So, good eye on that one. That's absolutely, I totally agree.
Sounds like kind of a hailing to the reputation of more European Eurocentric type of you know
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
prestige.
I think that that's one of the things too. In my book, I didn't talk about it so much today, but this idea of connoisseurship that's been developed around mezcal relies heavily on the same sorts of frameworks that we use for other luxury products. whether that be, wine or whiskey, single origin chocolate, micro lot coffee, right? There's something
Right,
very similar happening with mezcal.
right, right. Well, let's reach into the past a little bit.
All right.
You had mentioned that mezcal is tied to folklore, maybe more recent folklore, and one of our viewers was wondering if you know if there is an earlier folklore tied to mezcal, maybe from the Spanish arrival moving forward.
Um, there's lots of stories, the role of agave and fermented agave in Mesoamerica, it's there's a well-documented record of that. You look back at different codices and there's, the story of Mayahuel, which was the agave goddess, and
Oh, cool.
and the I'm not, I can't remember all the details of the stories, but the pulque, which was a fermented beverage that was something that people drank in pre-Hispanic Mesoamerica. There was a lot of folklore and stories around that was tied to, pre-Hispanic cosmology. And then, I think what happened when the Spanish came is, there was a real disdain for, to maintain the racial hierarchy, right? There was a lot of disdain for anything that was considered, native food and drink. And so there
Hmm.
was a real move to separate people and to, social status was really marked by what you drank or what you didn't drink.
Hmm.
And so I think drinking, um, certainly pulque, but also mezcal, was a marker of lower class status, right? If you were Spanish in the colonies, you aimed to drink wine or imported brandy or things from Europe. Um, and I think that the folklore, if anything, was that, mezcal was, this, and pulque likewise were things that would make you sick, they could kill you, they were, poisonous, and that was a way of maintaining social hierarchy.
Sure. Yeah. Interesting. Really interesting. Right. Someone asks, is there much formal monitoring of the less common species, such as tubala, and the impact of mezcal's growth on these indigenous plant populations?
People, that's a great question. I don't focus so much on the plant side of things, but certainly to that point, there's been a lot of concern about sustainability. A lot of, especially when mezcal first started taking off, a lot of the mezcal, like Tobala, which was just mentioned, were wild agaves that people would collect, from communal lands or wherever. They weren't necessarily domesticated varieties.
Mm.
And so people would often go and, sometimes poach agave, or, there was a lot of concern about plants disappearing and not being, if these, and
Right.
I didn't really note this in the presentation, but agave, especially the wild agaves, can take, upwards of 8 to 10 years before they mature. And then once you cut them, they don't, you can't, they don't regenerate, right? It's a one-time use plant to make these spirits. And so there was, a lot of concern around sustainability. One of the things that's happened with the so-called wild varieties is now many of them are actually domesticated. They figured out ways to, or semi-domesticated. Um, there's still concern about, the over cutting of wild agaves. Um, but I don't know what the latest research is. I don't know who's collecting data on this or who's monitoring it, so to
Mm.
speak. I still think agave in Oaxaca it's a little bit of a Wild West situation, right? Um, there was a lot of fear in the last 10 years of people coming down from tequila and buying illegally agaves from Oaxaca and transporting to make tequila because there was, at various points, there's been agave shortages in the highlands of tequila in Jalisco. And so people taking the agricultural stock and transporting it. And as you recall, you shouldn't be using other agaves to make tequila because its Dios signifies a particular type of agave. But that was happening, right? And so, there's a lot of illegal things that happen that probably aren't being monitored. So it's just kind of a patchy, complicated question. I don't have a great answer for it.
But it's not there doesn't seem to be an emergency in over harvesting of agave or something like that
Yeah,
due to the popularity.
what you see, well, I think that's been some people see that.
Mhm.
Like I said, I think the solution's been to domesticate a lot of the wild varieties.
Mm.
So that the plant species won't go extinct. And there's also been an uptick in people planting agave too. So, but that creates its own situation where people now, where are you growing this stuff and on whose land? How did you get the land? How are you, um, is it displacing traditional subsistence agriculture, right? Are people not
Right, right.
farming,
It's a good,
milpa, or which is, the traditional corn, squash, beans, chiles, to grow agave, right? So it is shifting agricultural patterns too.
that is
Which isn't a topic of my research, but I know that people, are looking at that and writing about that.
that is really interesting. The idea that it would displace other types of agriculture.
Yeah, well, that's what
And
happened with quinoa too, right?
yeah,
So
sure.
it changed subsistence agriculture in the Andes. There's, been documentation of that.
Yeah, awesome. When on that topic, one of our well-informed viewers pointed out that there's a book called Agave Spirits by Gary Navham that has a lot of good information about the impact on wild agaves.
Yeah, yeah. Gary and David Suro, who is what is it, Tequila Interchange Project. He's the head of that. They focus on the sustainability aspect much more. So yeah, that's a really good one to look at if you have questions and want more detail.
Cool. Well, inevitably, we have a question about the worm. Someone
Okay, bring it
wants to know
on.
about the mythology around having a worm, a hallucinogenic worm. Is that actually a thing or a folklore or?
Nobody's, I've never gotten a definitive, like, this is the history of the worm, right? There's lots of speculation about where it comes from, and first of all, it's not hallucinogenic.
Good to know.
It's,
Yeah.
it's just a worm in the bottle. And if you ask people now, like in contemporary Oaxaca about the worm, um, I've heard different stories. One that it's like a way to determine the age of the mezcal. Like, is it like, I mean, if you ever, this is kind of gross, but if you see a bottle of mezcal, it's kind of flaky and it's like the worm looks like it's been in there for a while. I mean,
Yeah,
who knows?
yeah,
But the best,
yeah.
the best, I think most reasonable sort of explanation of why people put a worm in it now is that it it's a flavor,
Hmm,
essentially. If you
interesting.
drink a mezcal de gusano, a mezcal with a worm, it has a notable flavor, right? So you think of it like as an infused alcohol, right? You could put like cherry or
Right.
like people will often put fruit in Oaxaca in the mezcal and it sits in there and infuses it with flavor. The worm does the same thing. So I think of it
Worm
now,
flavor. Got it. Okay.
it's
Yeah.
just, and it doesn't taste, I mean, it's just unique. You can taste it and it's like, oh, okay, this is the gusano, right? But I don't know initially. Nobody's ever gave me like the definitive answer on this.
Right, right. That's cool. Neat. Well, at least he knows it's not hallucinogenic, so
No,
that's
yeah, it won't hurt you. It might be have a high concentration of alcohol in it.
in the yeah, a juicy
But
worm.
yeah,
Sure.
maybe
Yeah.
that's where the hallucinations stem from.
So how did you come to this research? How did this become a thing for you?
Um, so I think I mentioned at the outset that I had been working as a cultural anthropologist in Oaxaca for close to 30 years. I lived there as an undergraduate in 1995. And when I lived there back in the mid 90s, I mean, the first time I had mezcal was out in a village. It wasn't in a like fancy, bar or anything like that. Those places didn't exist, right? If you were drinking
Right.
mezcal in Oaxaca City, you were in a kind of a sketchy cantina where you probably
Mhm.
shouldn't have been as a 20 something, undergraduate. Or people were drinking out in I drank the first time I had mezcal was at a Zapotec wedding in a village.
Wow.
where it was served in a very traditional fashion, whereby one person in charge of it who went around and would drink like a shot. Like there was kind of a ritualistic quality of the consumption of I didn't know what it
Hmm.
was. He was serving it out of a gasoline jug, with like this
Wow.
a little shot glass. But that was the context for mezcal then, right? It wasn't a fancy thing. It was something that people did, like I said, for local celebrations. It was a wedding I was at. And what happened was as in 2011, I was there, and I was thinking about a new project, and I was at a restaurant with a historian by the name of Bill Beasley, who taught for many years at the University of Arizona. And he ran a field school for historians every summer in Oaxaca. And I gave a talk, and we went out afterwards in the restaurant, and they brought us this menu. And it had like page after page of mezcals. And I was like, I've never noticed that before. It wasn't a thing to go to a nice restaurant in Oaxaca and drink mezcal.
Oh, wow.
And suddenly I was like, wait a minute, where did this come from? And so I started thinking like something's happening here. And it was 2011. It was right at the boom. Made sense. The timing was right then. And I said, this is something's happening. This something that's been here for a long time is changing. And I'm aware of it. And anybody that's looking at this menu is aware of this, right? So it was
Yeah.
entering into this new space, these new spaces in Oaxaca. And so I decided to sort of pursue it for the next 10 years.
That's so cool. And what a great journey, right? To going and drinking mezcal, right? 30 years ago out of a gasoline jug to, watching this whole transformation. That's just
Yeah, I
really
mean,
incredible.
something that, in when I was there in 1995, nobody would have imagined paying $100 for that
Right.
same alcohol that the guy had, he's walking around at this party with, right? Nobody would have paid $100 back then for that.
Oh yeah, yeah. Oh, fascinating. Wow. Wow. Well, we're right at 5 o'clock. Dr. Brulotte, thank you. What an incredible presentation, and really, really thought-provoking, economically, culturally, just a really, really cool project. And we can't wait to bring you back for whatever is coming up next. Fashion, maybe. So.
Maybe yeah, stay tuned. I appreciate everybody's attention, and thank you for having me.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, hopefully we'll run into you in Albuquerque one of these days.
That would be lovely. Look me up when you come down.
Will do. Okay.
All
Thanks
right.
so much.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.